Life under the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, Famine, and S-21, 1975 to 1979. When the Vietnamese army captured Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, from the Khmer Rouge in 1979, they found the city in a terrible state, and among the horrors they came across was a former high school that had been turned into a prison and was known as Security Prison 21, or just S-21. The dark buildings were enclosed in electrified barbed wire, and iron bars covered all the windows. The prisoners included academics, doctors, monks, students, and their teachers, as well as factory workers and engineers. All were accused of being enemies of the regime and tortured and forced to name their friends and family members as co-conspirators. Whole families were often brought in together to be interrogated and executed. Ultimately, paranoia meant that the regime began to turn on itself, and the cells were soon filled with party activists and their families, and even high-ranking politicians. At least 18,145 people had been imprisoned there, and all but a handful had been executed. S-21 was only one of more than 150 torture and execution centers established by the Khmer Rouge. Today, it stands as a memorial to the lives lost and to the brutality that they inflicted upon the people of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge was the name given to the members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the CPK, who ruled Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. They were led by the infamous Pol Pot, who attempted to purify Cambodian society along racial, social, and political lines. This led to one of the worst cases of genocide in history. Influenced by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, Pol Pot imagined his own super Great Leap Forward in Cambodia. After seizing power in a civil war in 1975, the CPK wanted to rapidly build the country under their own vision. Pol Pot compared the Cambodian revolution with those in China, Korea, and Vietnam, and proclaimed that no revolution would be as fast as his. Indeed, the CPK was obsessed with speed, and many in the party were paranoid that they would be replaced, and believed the faster their plans could be achieved, the safer they would be. The Super Great Leap was to be achieved independent of any foreign aid, through independent self-mastery. Khmer Rouge theorists believe that an initial period of self-imposed economic isolation would stimulate the rebirth of the crafts and the country's industrial capability. In order to follow this policy of extreme self-reliance, the CPK announced a 4-year plan to triple the country's rice production. However, Cambodia had suffered severely during the Civil War. Almost 3/4 of the draft animals needed to plow the fields had been killed, and by 1975, rice production had dropped by 84%. Such a rapid increase in production was impossible, but Pol Pot believed this was merely a matter of revolutionary willpower and instituted his policy of agricultural offenses, including a nationwide system of forced labor. He believed that achieving his economic goals would be as simple as winning the Civil War. The army and the CPK's agricultural warfare were the people, and manual labor was the key to victory. The purpose of every Cambodian was to work and advance the revolution. Villages were reorganized into cooperatives, and thousands of city dwellers were forced out of their homes to work on the farms. As a result of this policy, workers of all ages were forced to do 10 to 14 hours of hard labor per day in unsustainable conditions. Often, survivors reported working late into the night, particularly during harvest time, surrounded by encouraging slogans urging them to pledge to sacrifice your life to accomplish Angar's work, or to stay on the work site until death. A lot of food was needed to feed all these productive farmers. However, rice was also needed for Pol Pot's economic goals, so large amounts of rice were extracted from the population for party use and export. The CPK provided nothing in return. Fareth, one survivor of the period, recalled that she was assigned to a children's work unit when she was 11 years old. Fareth was ordered to carry soil, dig trenches, and help build a local dam. She and her unit lived at the work site, sleeping under a rough shelter made out of palm leaves. The dam was considered a highly important project for the revolution, and her unit were given a comparatively extravagant food ration of 2 daily portions of rice and salt and sometimes fish soup. Still, Fereth was constantly hungry and exhausted, as even such plentiful rations were not sufficient to sustain such hard labor. When her unit had finished at the worksite 3 months later, the local officials held a celebration to commemorate the occasion. The celebration included a play, revolutionary songs, and a mass marriage ceremony. The young Fereth says she was personally praised for her hard work and felt so proud of herself. It was only later that Fereth learned about what happened to her 2 younger sisters during this time. Her grandmother had been placed in charge of them because she was too old to work. She was starving and grew too weak to look after the girls. Without someone to care for them, the little girls were so hungry that they became ill and died of starvation. Meanwhile, absolute socialism meant that all natural resources were the property of the state, and any signs of individualism or privatism were banned, including private gardens, private ownership of foodstuffs, and even the act of cooking privately, which was punishable by imprisonment and execution. The people were not even allowed to forage for food in the countryside. After Fereth's little sisters had died, her grandmother survived on a small amount of hidden medicine. However, the Khmer Rouge searched the village every 3 days, looking for so-called contraband, including cooking equipment and rice. The small stash of medicine was found and confiscated, along with the family's only cooking pot by local Khmer Rouge cadres. Fereth's grandmother refused to suffer this final indignity, and within a week she succumbed to a combination of illness and starvation and passed away. Although the situation rapidly deteriorated into a full-blown famine, Pol Pot continued to talk about agriculture as a military operation, and he saw enemies everywhere. In his mind, any shortfalls in production were the fault of saboteurs and ideological enemies. Anybody who criticized the CPK's policies was branded an enemy of the state and was arrested, tortured, and executed. While the farmers starved, the CPK continued to make thousands of arrests with those who it believed to be enemies or a threat to the state. Many experienced doctors were executed or hid their profession because any sign of a privileged or urban background, including education or professional training, were viewed with extreme suspicion by the Khmer Rouge and created a high risk of execution if discovered. Indeed, this led to a lack of medicine and healthcare at a time when many of the nation's workers were sickly and starving. Instead of seeking a solution, the Khmer Rouge mocked its victims. The suspicious CPK accused overworked and underfed workers of feigning illness to avoid work, saying those that were starving had caught an imaginary disease. CPK slogans said that we must wipe out all those who imagine they are ill and expel them from our society. There was no respite for the exhausted, starving, and sickly population, and many victims simply just gave up and collapsed and died. Utilizing its secret police, the Khmer Rouge rounded up, tortured, and executed anybody who was seen as an enemy. This also included all foreigners and ethnic minorities, those with connections to the previous Cambodian government, professionals and intellectuals, including anybody who had an education or understood a foreign language, and party members who had fallen foul of the regime. Innocent men, women, and children, even newborn babies, were brought to prisons like S-21 and coerced into confessing for imaginary crimes and providing the names of other alleged enemies of the state. For 12 days and nights, an engineer called Chum-mei was tortured at S-21. His tormentors whipped him with bamboo sticks and broke his fingers when he tried to shield himself. They shackled his legs and removed his toenails with pliers. Chum-mei was also subjected to electric shocks, which he feared the most. Electrodes were placed inside of his ears and the shocks deafened him. He said that he felt as though his eyes were on fire and he was ready to tell them everything they wanted to hear. The interrogators forced him to sign a false confession that he was working for the CIA and had recruited other men and women. The dozens of innocent acquaintances that he had named were also arrested, tortured, and murdered. Chum-mei had never heard of the CIA and never found out why he had been arrested. He was one of the few who actually survived their stay at S-21. Most foreigners had left the country before the end of the Civil War, but several were imprisoned at S-21. Including the 26-year-old British teacher, John Dawson DeWorst. John was traveling the hippie trail to visit his friend in Malaysia when he met the owners of a small yacht, a Canadian, Stuart Glass, and a New Zealander, Kerry Hamill. They decided to sail north along the Thai coast toward Bangkok, when somehow the three men found themselves in Cambodian waters and their boat was seized by a revolutionary patrol boat. Stewart was shot dead immediately, while John and Kerry were taken to the infamous Tuol Sleng prison in Phnom Penh. The men were undoubtedly tortured, and records show that John had written a confession that mixed the true events of his life with false accounts about his life as a CIA agent. After confessing, most inmates were brought to one of several sites known as the Killing Fields. In the 4 years of the CPK's rule, more than 1 million people were executed and buried in mass graves at these places. Khmer Rouge soldiers, young men or women usually taken from peasant families, would then execute their victims using brutal and horrific methods, such as poison or literally beating them to death. In some cases, they even made their victims dig their own graves first as a final insult. To this day, their remains are still being uncovered at the Killing Fields. Starvation and executions under the Khmer Rouge were responsible for around 1.5 to 2 million deaths, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population at that time. After the Vietnamese seized Phnom Penh in 1979, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge fled into Thailand to wage a guerrilla war. Support for the CPK gradually waned and the Khmer Rouge became less powerful and disbanded. Pol Pot died of a heart attack in 1998. In the final interview before his death, he said that his conscience was clear and everything he had done for his country.
The Vorkuta Gulag, 1932 to 1962. The Soviet Gulag prison system, set up in the 1920s by the ruling Communist Party, were a series of forced labor camps. They held prisoners in harsh living conditions where any treatment was expected to be extreme and inhumane. Prisoners were both Soviet and foreign, the camp holding prisoners of war, dissidents, political prisoners, enemies of the state, and common criminals. Their diet provided little sustenance, leaving many near starvation. Beatings were common in the Gulag system, often brutal and unforgiving. Prisoners were sentenced for multiple reasons. For example, John H. Noble was arrested on charges of spying. The Noble's camera manufacturing company was merged with other German companies by the Soviets shortly after World War II. It was common for the Soviet authorities to arrest citizens in order to seize their property, and they were often given charges that would be hopeless in fighting. Stalin found the camps to be an efficient way to boost his country's industrialization, and no one was truly safe. Many of these prisoners never made it out alive, often being worked to death or dying of malnutrition. Among the worst of the gulags was the much-feared Vorkuta Gulag, known by the official title Vorkuta Corrective Special Labor Camp No. 6. Based near a coal mining community in the Komi Republic of West Russia, just north of the Arctic Circle, the Vorkuta Gulag was established in 1932, remaining active until 1962, and contained over 73,000 prisoners during its peak. The prisoners were assigned to provide labor for the nearby mine and the local logging operation, which was thriving at the time. A railway was constructed using the prisoners to ship coal and timber out of the area. The Gulag's perimeter consisted of tall barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and armed guards. Beyond the perimeter, there were regular armed patrols accompanied by guard dogs. Soldiers would accompany work details, ensuring no escape attempts were successful, though the reality was that there was nowhere for the prisoners to escape to. Vorkuta was in the middle of nowhere. The land surrounding Vorkuta, teeming with wolves, was the Soviet authorities' natural barrier between the Gulag prisoners and their freedom. And the climate in northern Russia was brutally cold, with extremely short summers and long winters. In Vorkuta, for 3 months out of the year, the sun did not set. Constant daylight ensued as another form of torture, provided by nature herself. This phenomenon is known as polar days. The regime at the Gulag was harsh. Prisoners were faced with 16-hour days of hard labor and an underwhelming diet of rye bread and buckwheat porridge called kasha. The lack of food was subsidized with potatoes and a little meat or fish. Prisoners often took to eating rats, stray dogs, or cats that might have inevitably wandered into the Gulag. Earning extra food was possible if you hit your unrealistically high work quota, but in order to do so, the prisoners had to work so hard that it had an adverse effect on their already deteriorating health. The result? Some prisoners literally worked themselves to death. The sheer hunger, excessive work, and living conditions often caused illness or death, so some prisoners resorted to getting admitted to the hospital where conditions were better and they could recover for a while. In order to get there, they resorted to cutting off their fingers, reopening healing wounds, or even drinking kerosene. Some prisoners of war from World War II were kept at the camp. This included the English trader Reginald Pleasance, who had joined the Nazi Waffen-SS as a sharpshooter. He spent 6 years in the camp before being released to the British authorities. And during the Korean conflict of the 1950s, it was rumored that a number of captured American pilots were also imprisoned at Vorkuta. Among the vast number of prisoners, American military personnel were no exception. One notable example being Homer Harold Cox, a U.S. military policeman who was arrested whilst off duty in East Berlin in 1949. Cox wouldn't be free of the Soviet tyranny until 1953. The American prisoner John H. Noble reported as many as 3,000 American prisoners in the Soviet camps. The freedom Noble gained came into being once his note was delivered to his German relatives. This note was then passed on to the United States authorities, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower intervened to get him freed. The corruption within the Gulag, combined with the atrocious conditions, became so bad that in 1953 the prisoners went on strike. One of the key leaders of the strike was John H. Noble. They demanded such things as lower production targets, wages, and to be allowed to write more than 2 letters a year. At first, the authorities tolerated this act of rebellion, being that it was relatively peaceful. Moscow sent commissioners to negotiate with the prisoners. Some minor concessions were made, including being granted the privilege of being allowed to write 2 letters a month and the right to 1 visitor a year. But the prisoners felt this was not enough and refused to go back to work. After 2 weeks, the warden's patience had run out. He sent in the army to arrest the ringleaders of the strike. The situation turned violent, and the army openly fired on the prisoners. It is estimated that over 60 prisoners were killed and hundreds more were injured. Afterwards, conditions at the Gulag slowly improved, and in 1962, the camp was permanently closed down, with most of its inmates released. As for the Gulag system itself, the permanent dismantling began during the 1950s. This was in part due to the economic and political viability of maintaining the gulags diminishing. Political reform played a key role in the regression of the camps. With Nikita Khrushchev coming to power after the death of Stalin, Khrushchev began a series of reforms known as de-Stalinization when he came to power in 1958. Finally, in the early 1960s, the last remaining gulags were closed down, Vorkuta being one of the last to close.
Kim Jong-il versus the starving masses of North Korea, 1993 to 2011. On the day of Kim Jong-il's birth on North Korea's cherished Pakdu Mountain in 1942, a double rainbow appeared along with a bright new star in the heavens. The birthday of the now deceased leader, known as the Day of the Shining Star, is celebrated as a national holiday all over the world, where people rejoice and pay their respects for as many as 5 days. Or so the North Korean propaganda would have us believe. In reality, Kim Jong-il was born in 1941 in the Siberian village of Vyatskoy. He would follow his father Kim Il-sung as the second leader of North Korea, living an extravagant and eccentric lifestyle while oppressing and starving the ordinary people. His son Kim Jong-un rules today, and the population continue to live in abject poverty and terror in a strange land, isolated and cut off from the world around it. The Kim dynasty has managed to build a very prevalent cult of personality in North Korea, heavily restricting or censoring any information that comes into or leaves the country. This is made possible by the support the regime has managed to sustain from the considerable strength of the nation's armed forces, ranked as one of the world's largest standing armies. At nursery school, children learn that while flowers need the sun to grow, children need the love of the great leader to grow. The system of indoctrination, control, and self-criticism seems both frightening and astonishing. On arrival to Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, all visitors to the country must first lay offerings and flowers at the foot of 2 giant statues of Kim Jong-il and his father, Kim Il-sung. Independent travel for foreigners in the country is impossible, and even for a citizen of Pyongyang, a permit is required to travel outside of the capital. While citizens of the nation lived under the constant threat of famine, Kim Jong-il ate extravagantly. His favorite meals included sushi and shark's fin soup, a controversial delicacy, as well as roast donkey and fresh lobsters. He ate with silver chopsticks and then washed it all down with French wine and champagne. The supreme leader even kept a regal wine cellar of over 10,000 bottles and was known to have spent up to $720,000 a year on Hennessy cognac. The average North Korean, on the other hand, took home less than $2,000 a year. For them, the food choices were and still are highly restricted. Breakfast usually consisted of corn or maize porridge with powdered milk for children. At local grocers, white cabbage, cucumber, and tomato were the most common items to be found. Eggs and meat were considered rare. The main staple of the North Korean diet was rice, though bread was sometimes available and was often accompanied by a form of butter that was regularly rancid. In fact, the people of North Korea ate worse than even Kim Jong-il's dogs, who during the life of the curious dictator were fed a rich diet of expensive beef that an average North Korean would very rarely have seen, if ever. Indeed, one day Kim's kennel master was caught stealing the dog food and was sentenced to hard labor for 2 years. On the matter of beef, in the year 2000, Kim Jong-il decided that he wanted to try McDonald's. As the Western restaurant was forbidden in North Korea, he sent his chef to Beijing to buy hamburgers. Of course, by the time his chef returned, the hamburgers were cold, so Kim ate cold hamburgers. Shortly afterwards, he began a campaign to feed his university students gojigopang, which is Korean for double bread with meat. This new delicacy that Kim was credited with inventing bore a remarkable similarity to your common hamburger, however. Another of Kim's ideas to feed the population included breeding giant rabbits. A German farmer famous for breeding rabbits the size of dogs was apparently asked to help set up a farm in North Korea to alleviate food shortages. To begin with, he sent a batch of 12 rabbits to North Korea, but was shocked to hear that they were eaten at Kim's birthday banquet that year. According to the North Korean media, Kim was a man of many talents. Official records show that Kim was a prolific writer, with 1,500 books published in his name, as well as 6 full operas that are better than any in the history of music. His sporting prowess was also beyond compare. The media reported that the first time Kim picked up a golf club, he shot 11 holes in one on North Korea's only golf course. His 17 bodyguards all verified the record-breaking feat. Kim then decided to retire from the sport forever. Kim Jong-il was also an avid movie fan and director, with a library of as many as 15,000 movies. The James Bond series and Rambo were among his favorites. As a passionate director, Kim saw that his movies were stiff and lifeless compared to the other films being released globally, however. He believed that this failure was down to the actors and the crew. As a result, in January 1978, Kim sent a pair of agents posing as a movie producer and an influential businesswoman to meet Choi Eun-hee, a South Korean Marilyn Monroe. The movie producer offered to start a new film company with Choi in Hong Kong. However, after Choi arrived, seemingly to be escorted to one of the company's film studios, she was forced onto a boat, sedated when she attempted to escape, and abducted to Nambo Harbor, North Korea. The actress found herself being given a brief private tour of Pyongyang in Kim's Mercedes before being brought to an extravagant single-story villa called Building Number 1. Soon, Choi would be invited to attend parties with Kim's officials and friends, as well as family dinners and events, even to his 37th birthday. Kim Jong-il spent a lot of time with Choi and respected her opinions on the film industry. Her ex-husband, Shin Sang-ok, a renowned South Korean film director, was kidnapped to North Korea 6 months later. He was given lavish accommodations like Choi. However, he attempted to escape twice and was consequently detained at a prison labor camp for disobedience. Here, Shin would have been accompanied by thousands of people considered by Kim's government to be criminals or political radicals. Offenses included singing South Korean pop songs at home, leaving the state's borders without permission, or being in any way related to someone who had been arrested. 3 years later, the pair were reunited and ordered to help the supreme leader make films. Kim understood that the propaganda of his films was not appealing to international audiences, and so he allowed Shin to broaden the subject material. Their most expensive film, made in the late 1980s, was Pugasari, a monster feature that starred a giant creature, heavily inspired by Godzilla, who sides with a feudal peasant rebellion against a corrupt monarchy. After 8 years of making many films for Kim, Choi and Shin ultimately escaped to a U.S. embassy while abroad in Vienna. In contrast to Kim's lavish lifestyle, entertainment options for the people of North Korea were far fewer. The capital, Pyongyang, had around 8 cinemas, but the films on show were heavily propagandist, and the plot often revolved around the North Koreans emerging victorious in a war against the South Koreans, Japanese, or Americans. Phones were only installed for high-ranking officials, and citizens had to report purchases of radios and TVs, which were checked by the authorities to ensure each set was tuned to official programming. Possession of foreign books, magazines, and newspapers was forbidden. The power supply in Pyongyang, and across the entirety of North Korea for that matter, was highly unstable. Under Kim Jong-il and continuing today, the arms industry was prioritized on the national power grid, therefore drawing much of the country's generated electricity away from the average citizen. Power outages were very common as a result, with recent studies suggesting that only 1 in 4 citizens had access to electricity in North Korea. To make matters worse, most citizens in Pyongyang lived in high-rise tower blocks, and due to chronic power cuts, were forced to rely on the stairs over the untrustworthy elevators. Many families tried to relocate older relatives to lower floors, but this was very difficult and often required a bribe. Apartments were also very cold, and if the electricity was suspended, no heat was available. Residents were then forced to cover the windows in plastic sheeting or newspapers in an effort to keep in the warmth. For almost 20 years, Kim Jong-il led the country as eternal leader generalissimo, living less as a world leader than he did a caricature of a despotic dictator. When he died, the people took to the streets, weeping and pounding the pavement with their hands in uncontrollable grief. This was far from an outburst of authentic emotion, however. According to one young student in Pyongyang, his entire future depended on his ability to cry. Mourning for the deceased supreme leader was, in itself, a matter of life and death. The Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962. In 1949, the Communist Party of China had emerged victorious after a brutal and bitter civil war. Their leader, Mao Zedong, set about radically transforming China, which, despite being a vast and highly populated country, was politically weak, very traditional, and lacking in industry. The Communists began to modernize China, drawing up the first 5-year plan in 1952, emulating the Soviet model of industrialization. This saw extensive investment in heavy industry within the cities in the attempt to increase production. The problem was that in a nation where 4/5 of the population lived in rural areas, there simply wasn't enough people working in heavy industry to allow it to grow to the desired levels. As well as this, the rate of agricultural food production wasn't high enough to allow the industrial workforce to expand further and keep the workers fed. Mao therefore turned his attention to the countryside. Rural China was deeply traditional, with society based on the family and deference to the elderly. Peasants would work the land in small family groups, keeping most of their harvest and selling on small amounts. For Mao, seeking to build a communist society in which everyone worked for the state, and a nation which could rival the USA and USSR, this needed to change. Land reform, where estates had been taken from rich landowners and redistributed to the peasants, had taken place shortly after the communists had come to power. Collectivization, where peasants lost their own pieces of land and instead worked for wages on land owned by the state, had also begun to take place. Mao believed this wasn't enough to expand both agricultural and industrial production, and instead introduced the second 5-year plan in 1958. This would become known as the Great Leap Forward. The Soviet model of development was now rejected. Agricultural and political decisions were decentralized. Technical expertise within the state bureaucracy were now distrusted, with political ideology emphasized. The plan was designed to get laborers in the countryside working at full capacity. This would allow an agricultural surplus, part of which could be forcibly purchased by the government in order to feed industrial workers and expand production in the cities. The plan also sought to find a method to organize rural workers to directly contribute to industrial production. To achieve all of these objectives, the establishment of communes was ordered on a vast scale. In a matter of months, millions of peasants were forcibly banded together in large-scale communes, numbering 20,000 or more people. These communes meant the complete end to individual small holdings, as now all farmers in the commune were responsible for the collective performance of their land. It was hoped that labor would be more efficient and food production would grow rapidly, therefore helping agriculture and industry to grow together and prevent the food shortages that had held back industry before. The organization of the communes also provided childcare facilities for the very young and houses of happiness for the elderly, freeing up workers to do their jobs. Backing was received for the collectivization policy by a wide-ranging program of propaganda. People were encouraged to contribute however they could, such as banging pots to deter sparrows from eating the crops or shooting them down. Millions supported the Great Leap Forward enthusiastically at first, especially as it meant readily available food in the commune kitchens regardless of how much work an individual had done. The policy also gave great power away and influence to local officials in the countryside, who had the role of managing the communes. Mao also wanted agricultural workers to contribute to industry under the slogan, "walking on two legs." Agricultural workers were drafted from their jobs as farmers to work in the countryside factories. Backyard furnaces were also established where farmers with little to no experience would produce iron and steel. Everything from cooking pots to radiators were to be melted down, while wooden furniture and trees became fuel. The plan was to increase Chinese steel production from 5 million tons a year in 1957 to a massive 100 million tons annually by 1962. Towards the autumn of 1958, it seemed to many as though things were going well. However, the reality was hidden by the uncommonly good weather of that year, which had led high levels of agricultural production. By the end of the year, some officials were beginning to worry in the knowledge that over-optimism had led rural workers to eating too much of the harvest, leaving stockpiles for the winter and spring of the following year dangerously low. Many also recognized the fact that a large proportion of laborers lacked the incentive to work in such large communes, or that transport and supply problems were causing issues. The steel which was being produced by rural laborers was also found to be unusable, and much of it was left to rust. Drafting so many agricultural workers into the factories had caused a shortage of labor on the farms. Scaring or shooting sparrows till they dropped caused a severe ecological imbalance. It resulted in an explosion in the vermin population, including crop-eating insects, now with no predators. Deep plowing was another policy that caused great harm to crops. Instead of planting seeds in the normal shallow depths, they were to be planted 5 feet or 1.5 meters deep into the soil and extremely close together. The result was that this severely stunted the growth of the seeds due to overcrowding. Mao soon began to talk of scaling back the Great Leap Forward. However, political rivalry and suspicion soon intervened, with Mao ordering purges carried out against those who criticized his policy. This had the effect of encouraging local officials desperate to protect their positions to continue to support the Great Leap Forward, at times even more keenly than they had done before. Therefore, despite the fact that agricultural production had not expanded, these officials did not dare question orders requiring them to send a large proportion of the grain that did remain to the cities. This had the effect of terrible starvation in the countryside, which became even worse with bad droughts and floods in the harvests of 1959 and 1960. The communal kitchens where rice had been freely given in 1958 was now severely rationed in what people received, and in the worst cases, there was nothing available at all. Laborers who didn't meet their quotas would not receive their food rations, so those who were unable to work starved to death. There were accounts of people eating everything living or growing that was left: goose, cats, dogs, lime plaster of walls, and the leaves and bark off trees were consumed.
After these were gone, people even resorted to cannibalism and murder to feed their extreme hunger. Despite the famine in the countryside, Mao continued to export grain worldwide and refused any foreign aid to maintain face and convince people that his plans were working. As the food supply going to the cities began to dwindle, famine also hit urban areas. The death toll for the Great Leap Forward at the lower end estimate is said to be 18 million, while upper estimates find that some 45 million people died. Mao was held responsible for this catastrophe by many people within the Chinese Communist Party. He remained as party chairman, but by 1962, many decisions to do with policy and the economy were taken over by other people. The communes were scaled back, individual farming was once again permitted, and industrial workers were given greater incentives to work hard. Mao, though, remained a powerful figure, able to launch the Cultural Revolution in 1966.
The Real-Life Battle Royale, Nazino, Russia, 1933. On May 18, 1933, on the direct orders of Stalin himself, 5,000 men and women arrived at Nazino, a small isolated island on the river Orb, deep in the remote and barren wilderness of western Siberia. Within a matter of weeks, 4,000 of them would either just die from exposure, disappear, drown, or be eaten. This was the real-life battle royale. The Soviet Union was a miserable place to live during this period, with severe food shortages which resulted in millions of people dying of starvation. Any form of criticism of the state was dealt with brutally, where the offender would probably get a life sentence and be sent to a gulag, where they would literally be worked to death carrying out hard labor. Stalin's purge of the so-called socially harmful elements of society mainly concentrated on certain groups, such as the Cossacks, ethnic minorities, intellectuals, and the kulaks, who were peasants who owned their own land and were sometimes hesitant in contributing a share of their goods to the common collective. Even the armed forces were not exempt, as mass purges were commonplace, which normally resulted in the execution of its most experienced officers. The Nazino settlers also included a wide cross-section of urban society, not just criminals and vagrants, but also regular workers, children, and pensioners. Many were taken simply because they had failed to obtain an internal passport. However, others included a party member who had stepped out of her apartment without her party card, a worker buying cigarettes who had left his passport at home, a 12-year-old girl waiting at a train station while her mother bought bread, as well as the pregnant wife of a naval officer and a 103-year-old man. None of them were pioneers ready to settle and farm a harsh and unforgiving land. In February 1933, the head of the secret police, Genrik Jagoda, and the head of the Gulag labor camp system, Matvey Berman, got together and approached Stalin with a plan to resettle 2 million of these people into what was thought to be the vast area of untapped natural resources in Siberia and Kazakhstan. However, the environment was harsh and extremely cold, and much of the area was tundra and frozen all year round. Even when it did thaw out in the summer, the ground became swampy and infertile and unsuitable for any kind of agriculture. To add to this, the air would have been thick with mosquitoes. One of the areas that was chosen for the project was Nazino Island, which was on the north bank of the Orb River, deep inside the Siberian wilderness. The island was only ever visited by the local Ostyak people from the nearby village of Nazino to gather tree bark to use as firewood. It was relatively small, measuring just 2 miles or about 3.2 kilometers long and 650 yards or 595 meters wide, and mostly made up of inhospitable swampland. Hunting and foraging was going to be nearly impossible. Many thousands of the so-called undesirables, which also included hardened and petty criminals by now, were being held in overcrowded prisons in Moscow and Leningrad. So, in the spring of 1933, they were loaded into all sorts of railway carriages, which included cattle trucks, and began a 10-day journey to Tomsk, where the half-completed transit camps were waiting for them. During the journey, gangs of criminals systematically beat up and robbed their fellow passengers. On May 14, 1933, after the prisoners had been processed and selected, 5,000 of these settlers set off on their journey to Nazino Island. They were loaded onto river barges that had only been designed to carry timber down the River Orb and were only given 200 grams of bread each a day for the 5-day journey. By the time they had arrived at Nazino, 30 people had died on the barges, and a third of them were too weak to even stand. The authorities had failed to provide any form of shelter on the island, nor any basic tools or building materials to construct basic shelters against the elements. On their first night there, it snowed heavily, and almost 300 people had frozen to death by the morning from exposure. This happened every night, and some people were actually burned alive from laying too close to the campfires that they had made to try to keep themselves warm. 20 tons of flour had been left on the island for the settlers, but straight away fights broke out when guards tried to distribute it daily, and they ended up firing at the mob to break them up. As no ovens were available there to make bread or anything else, the settlers either ate the flour raw or mixed it with dirty water from the river, and this led to an outbreak of dysentery. Daily fighting soon broke out over whatever resources were still available, and killings became commonplace, and the bodies were robbed of any possessions they had, including money and especially gold fillings and crowns from their mouths. To add to all this misery, 9 days later another 1,200 settlers arrived on the island, and very quickly groups of rival gangs started to form, and murder and extortion became commonplace. In desperation, many of the settlers tried to construct crude rafts out of pieces of wood that they could find to flee the island, but they were so basic that they were not fit for purpose and they just sank. So they simply drowned in the ice-cold river and their bodies were washed up on the shore along the River Orb. If they did manage to reach the opposite bank of the river alive, the guards would go and hunt them down for sport, and no questions were ever asked as to what had happened to them. Because of the lack of sanitation, there was soon an outbreak of typhus, which many succumbed to because of their already weak state of health. But far worse was to come, because within a week, a doctor discovered cases of cannibalism beginning to appear on the island as people became desperate to find something to eat. It started out with cutting slices of flesh from the dead corpses and cooking them, but then progressed to killing people who were so weak or were so close to death, and therefore so vulnerable and unable to defend themselves. When one survivor was asked if he had eaten human flesh while on the island, he replied that he had only eaten livers and hearts, and then only from people who were dying anyway. Another incident involved a young woman who was having a relationship with one of the guards. When he was not around to protect her, some men tied her to a tree, killed her, and cut off everything from her body that they could eat. Despite the many arrests and executions by the guards, the situation was brought under control when, after a damning internal report was submitted, it was decided to abandon the settlement on Nazino Island only after a month after it had been set up. Approximately 1/3 of the settlers had died, while another third were reported as missing, possibly escaped, drowned, or eaten. Just over 2,000 people had survived. Unknown to the settlers at the time, all of their hardships had been in vain, as back in Moscow there had been a change in policy, and Stalin and the authorities had decided to cancel the whole settler experiment program. There was an official investigation into the Nazino incident, but the findings were never made public at the time. Several local officials and guards were given short prison sentences or dismissed from office. In the mid-1980s, the human rights group Memorial made the details of their findings public after they had investigated the episode themselves. A memorial cross was placed on the island in 1993 to remember those who had lost their lives there. The inscription on its plaque reads, "To the victims of political repression, 1933 to 1993. And every June, the local villagers from Nazino cross the river and place a wreath on the memorial. The KGB, who they were and what they did. The KGB was the chief government intelligence and security agency of the Soviet Union from 1954 until its collapse in 1991. The Soviet Union was made up of 15 republics: Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarusia, Estonia, Georgia, Kyrgyzia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldavia, Tajikistan, Turkmenia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. In some republics, the KGB didn't operate directly, but there were similar organizations that carried out the same tasks. The KGB consisted of two parts, intelligence services and military units that were totally separate from the Soviet armed forces. They operated as a completely independent government agency. And although the KGB marketed itself as the intelligence agency of the USSR, it was also a form of secret police, ensuring citizens all across the republic stayed in line with Soviet ideals, and political dissidence was dealt with quietly and often fatally. KGB stands for Komitet Государственной Безопасности, which translates to Committee for State Security in English. The most famous former KGB agent alive today is Russian President Vladimir Putin. In March 1954, the KGB replaced the existing MVD that had been in place the previous year and had such well-informed and successful agents of espionage that Joseph Stalin knew far less about his own agents than those working for the UK and the US. Over the course of the war and beyond, Soviet intelligence agencies had thousands of international spies operating in dozens of countries, and at one point was the largest institution of its kind. But at home, they were uncomfortably compared to Germany's World War II secret police, the Gestapo. Political dissidents, those who spoke out about anti-communist ideals or against the government, frequently found their homes invaded and themselves arrested, at best. As the world headed into the Cold War, this only intensified with the KGB monitoring both private and public opinions of Soviet citizens at home. After the war, waves of anti-communist sentiment spread throughout the West, heightening the tensions of the hardening Cold War between the Soviets, Europeans, and Americans. This was called the Second Red Scare. The first had occurred decades earlier between 1917 and 1920, and before the creation of the KGB. During this period, the Americans became aware of the volume of Soviet spies across the US, living both legally and illegally. They feared what these spies would do to their society and political ideals. This was a particular fear of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who spearheaded investigations that led to hundreds of accusations of treason and subversion. It's impossible to know the true number of victims of McCarthy's fanatical approach to rooting out Russian spies, but estimates place the number of those imprisoned in the hundreds, and it's predicted over 10,000 lost their jobs as a result of being questioned. Subsequently, over the course of the early 1950s, the number of Soviet spies across America dropped dramatically, with the last major illegal spy, Rudolf Abel, being betrayed by his assistant in 1957. Nevertheless, at home, the KGB continued to tighten the reins on Soviet society. In the 1960s, due to a U.S. political dissident, John Anthony Walker, Soviet intelligence was able to decipher thousands of U.S. Navy messages, giving them a decisive military edge should they choose to act upon it. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 began with a protest by university students against the USSR, as well as their hardline Stalinist former head of state, Matyas Rákosi. Prague Spring began in 1969, when Czechoslovakia tried to assert its independence from the USSR by reclaiming political power back into its member state. On both occasions, the Red Army of the USSR was quick to act, invading the countries and shooting thousands of protesters and civilians to quell the uprising. As usual, the KGB quickly and quietly worked alongside the Red Army and USSR's other operatives to destabilize the revolutions. In Czechoslovakia, they infiltrated pro-democratic institutions to undermine political sentiments and reported back to the Soviet government. On October 29, 1956, in Hungary, a report by Chief of the KGB Ivan Serov claimed inaccurately that armed groups were seeking out communists and killing them, as well as any state security officials they found. The Hungarian military leader Paul Meliter responded by negotiating a diplomatic meeting between a Hungarian delegation and the USSR. During the midnight of that same evening, Serov ordered the arrest of the Hungarian delegation. The following day, after the removal of their leader by the KGB, the Soviet army attacked Hungary again. The uprising was quelled just 7 days later, officially ending on November 11, 1956. After the uprising was over, Serov and the KGB continued to monitor Hungary closely, once again employing tactics to monitor any internal dissidents. By 1964, the head of the USSR, Nikita Khrushchev, had fallen out of political favor. He had denounced Stalin years earlier, a shocking move to the USSR, and had moved to eradicate Stalin's policies. This, coupled with his later handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, led to other government officials and the KGB chief, Vladimir Semechesny, to plot his removal. Unlike most former heads of the USSR, Khrushchev did not meet an unfortunate end. On October 13th, when he landed at Vnukovo Airport, he was met by Semechesny and other heads of the coup, who took him to the Kremlin, with little resistance from Khrushchev himself. 24 hours later, the premier announced his allegedly voluntary removal from power. He spent the rest of his life in a house paid for and monitored by the KGB, who recorded his every word and all visitors who came to his house. Khrushchev spent his last years writing memoirs that the KGB tried desperately to get their hands on. In 1970, after he was hospitalized, the agency instead went after his son, who finally handed over his father's original memoir notes, having already successfully smuggled copies to a Western publisher, much to the KGB's dismay. In the 1970s, the KGB became more heavily involved in South Asia. They influenced political opinion across newly formed Bangladesh, starting in 1973 with the installment of the first president, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Initially democratic, just 2 years later, Mujibur formed a one-party state. The KGB's influence grew exponentially across the rest of the 70s, despite Mujibur's own reign coming to an abrupt end 6 months later, when he and most of his family were assassinated during a coup. This didn't slow down KGB influence in Bangladesh, however. By the end of the decade, the number of officials in the area had more than doubled, and they had printed numerous defamatory news articles targeting the newly appointed and West-friendly de facto president, Ziaur Rahman. The KGB were heavily involved in Afghanistan in the late 1970s. They had heavily influenced political leadership in the country and sought to control it by placing a puppet president in the leadership role. But they were thwarted when the second president, Hafizullah Amin, took control of the country. They found themselves less able to control and influence his leadership. He wrote memos in English and spoke regularly with the United States. Eventually, the KGB claimed he was an American spy and undertook the successful operation of Storm 333, where they assassinated Amin. Their actions marked the start of the Soviet-Afghan War. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Over the preceding years, the states had become looser republics, eventually culminating in the complete dissolution of the Union, much to the distaste of the KGB. In August 1991, the chairman of the KGB, Vladimir Khrushchev, launched a coup against Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, alongside other Soviet leaders. Their intention was to re-centralize Soviet power in Russia, removing the increased liberties that had been given to the Soviet states. Ultimately, 2 days later, they failed, and it marked the final end stages of the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union and the KGB themselves.
Hungarian uprising, Budapest, 1956, the Cold War. After the Second World War, Hungary was absorbed as a satellite state of the Soviet Union. A communist government was established. Political opposition was purged, and Matyas Rákosi, who was a strong supporter of Stalin, was appointed leader. Imre Nagy would replace him in 1953 when Stalin died, until 1955 because of his independent attitude. Rákosi would again seize power, but his Stalinist leadership style, such as his use of the secret police to brutally put down opponents, made him unpopular with Hungarians, as did the low living standards. In June 1956, in the spirit of de-Stalinization, Rákosi was forced by the Soviet Politburo to resign as General Secretary. Khrushchev's policies of de-Stalinization also encouraged a sense of freedom among Hungarians to criticize the Soviet regime and improve relations with the West. A rise of protests by students and workers waving Hungarian flags with the communist emblem in the center cut out arose in Budapest.
erupting into active fighting in October 1956. The rebels were successful in the first stages of the revolution against Soviet troops. They pulled down Stalin's statue and released political prisoners. Andras Hegedus was forced to resign, and the popular Imre Nagy now became prime minister. Fighting ceased on the 28th of October as the Hungarians believed that Soviet troops had withdrawn entirely. The new Hungarian government under Nagy began to make reforms for free elections and an end of the secret police. In a radio address to the Hungarian people, Nagy declared that Hungary would withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. Khrushchev was not happy with the idea of Hungary withdrawing, therefore making it neutral against the Soviet Union's enemies. On November 1, 1956, Soviet troops invaded Hungary, re-entering Budapest on the 4th of November. Nagy had appealed to the United Nations to support the revolution, but Western powers did not intervene for risk of starting a global confrontation with the USSR. The Hungarians could not continue fighting against the numerous Soviet troops and tanks, and street fighting ceased after 2 weeks. A new pro-Soviet government was set up under János Kadar, while Nagy was caught and later executed for treason in 1958.
A day in the life of Stalin. Joseph Stalin, originally Ios Bessariones Dzhugashvili, was born in the small Georgian town of Gori in December of 1878. He grew up poor but excelled at school. After a brief stint in a seminary, Joseph became interested in socialist politics, inspired by the writings of Karl Marx. By 1912, Vladimir Lenin, who he had first met in 1905 at a Bolshevik conference in Tammerfors, Finland, had made him a member of the Bolshevik Central Committee. This paved the way for him to play a key role in the Bolshevik uprising of 1917, which brought about the demise of the Tsarist Russia and ultimately led to the establishment of the USSR in 1922. After the death of Lenin in 1924 and the ensuing power struggle, it was Stalin who emerged victorious, ruling the USSR with an iron fist until his death in 1953. It's believed that Stalin was responsible for the deaths of at least 6 million people, while some scholars have argued that the figure was closer to 20 million. Stalin is therefore considered to have been one of the most ruthless and notorious dictators of the 20th century. Despite the brutality of his regime and the violence often shown towards those who lived under its authority, Stalin was a crucial ally in the fight against Nazi Germany. Without the Soviet Union's role in World War II, it's very likely that the Allies would have failed in their attempt to liberate Europe from the Axis powers. At the outbreak of the so-called Great Patriotic War, Stalin increased his workday significantly. According to Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Stalin worked as many as 15 hours a day and took no less than 5 leading positions upon himself. These responsible roles included Supreme Commander, General Secretary of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Soviet Union, Head of the State Defense Committee, and People's Commissar of Defense. Aware of the mounting stress on the Supreme Commander, Zhukov was cleverly able to gauge Stalin's mood. When drawing deeply on his pipe, it meant he was in a good mood. If, however, Stalin failed to light his pipe once it was out of tobacco, it was a sign of impending anger. This understanding allowed Zhukov to deal with Stalin in a way that the other generals couldn't. It's believed that Stalin suffered from insomnia and was not an early riser. He often slept in his clothes, on a military-style camp bed in his personal residence, the Kunstvordacha. Failing any earlier emergencies that required his immediate attention, he usually rose at about 11 a.m. to receive the first reports on how the war was progressing. Stalin would have a light breakfast before spending several hours working, which involved taking reports, issuing orders, and conducting meetings either at his home in Kunstvo or at the Kremlin. Twice a day at noon and 9 p.m., he received updates from his Stavka plenipotentiaries, men who were directly overseeing the war effort. Failure to submit these reports was met by a harsh rebuke from the supreme leader, often in the form of threats against their position within the government and even against their lives. In the early hours of the evening, Stalin would head to his office, known to the regime insiders as the Little Corner, which was on the second floor of the Kremlin. From here, he would run sessions of the GKO, the Soviet State Defense Committee, which can be best compared to a war cabinet. These sessions would go on for many hours, sometimes not ending until well into the night. This was a particularly tense time of day for Stalin's underlings, both military and civilian. The dictator's paranoia became increasingly worse throughout his reign, and entry to the little corner was tightly controlled. No weapons were permitted, and everyone, no matter their rank, had to carry their identification papers. Visitors were encouraged to never disagree with Stalin, not to engage in small talk, and to leave his presence quickly once they had finished giving their report. The threat of arrest was ever present. At the end of Stalin's heavy workday, he would frequently invite other high-ranking members of the regime to join him for dinner at Kunstvo, often to be followed by a movie. These were not the kind of invitations that could be turned down. After his men were finally allowed to return to their homes for a few hours of much-needed rest, Stalin would end the day reading books before finally going to sleep in the early hours of the morning. Whilst Stalin had the luxury of not having to rise until late into the day, many members of the regime were not so fortunate and had to be ready for work in the early hours in order to ensure that the state ran smoothly. Stalin's control over the lives of those who worked for him, including his generals, was so pervasive that many of them were even given set sleep times. Alexander Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff of the Soviet Armed Forces and Deputy Minister of Defense, for example, was told that he had to be asleep between the hours of 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. Stalin would personally phone him during these times to ensure that his orders were being followed. Such was the extent of Vasilevsky's workload, though, that he was forced to order his staff to lie to Stalin and say that he was resting when he was in fact trying to sneak in a few extra hours of work. In the early years of the war, while there was still a serious threat of defeat by the Germans, Stalin was not a heavy drinker. He also strongly encouraged sobriety in those who worked for him. From 1943 onward, though, this began to change, and Stalin's near-nightly dinners became increasingly drunken events, especially for his men. These affairs usually began late in the afternoon, when Stalin's magnates would receive invitations to join him for dinner. As before, these were not the sort of invitations that could be declined. Over the course of the next 6 hours or so, Stalin's associates were encouraged to drink to excess. Stalin joined in the drinking, although his drinks were often watered down on medical advice. These were not fun social events for the Soviet officials. A single mistaken word could place either themselves or their families in danger. In fact, the statesman Anastas Mikoyan claimed that Stalin forced us to drink to loosen our tongues. The situation became so dire that some of the men were prepared to risk Stalin's anger and attempt to maintain some degree of sobriety through tactics such as sneaking out of the room for naps or having waitresses pour them colored water instead of wine. It was in this atmosphere that a great deal of Soviet state business was done. Throughout the evening, Stalin would continue to issue orders, receive messages, and even approve executions if necessary. According to Field Marshal Zhukov, many decisions relating to the armed forces and the security of the Soviet Union were regulated in these unofficial meetings, as the contingent of the gatherings largely consisted of the USSR's highest-ranking officials. Late into the night, usually around 2 a.m., Stalin would suggest watching a movie, sometimes more than one. He is known to have favored westerns, detective films, and gangster movies. After this, he would sometimes suggest another bite to eat, meaning that his poor, exhausted, and now hungover officials often didn't get home until well past daybreak. As in earlier years, Stalin would end his day reading books before finally falling asleep. This state of affairs continued until March 1, 1953, when Stalin suffered a massive stroke. He lingered on for several days before ultimately passing away on the evening of the 5th. Following the appropriate preparation, his body was then displayed in the famous Hall of Columns for mourners throughout the Soviet Union to visit.
The Kim Dynasty, a land of public executions, extreme poverty, and rampant famine. North Korea has been ruled by the same authoritarian regime since its founding in 1948. The Kim Dynasty, which was installed after Kim Il-sung came to power at the conclusion of World War II and Japan's retreat from Korea, has held an iron grip over the country for 3 generations now. Forced disappearances, kidnappings, and work camps break the populace and foster a fierce loyalty, and on some level, desperate love for the state. Needless to say, North Korea isn't exactly a hot housing market. In fact, between the years of 1960 and 2022, less than 50,000 people immigrated to North Korea. For comparison, over 8 times this amount immigrated to Afghanistan during the same time frame, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. North Korean culture. Indeed, there are a lot of things keeping people from moving to North Korea, but fashion, art, and a really cool zoo aren't one of them. Not only does North Korea pressure their citizens to choose from a whopping 15 unique haircuts, they made sure to provide an equal amount to both males and females. Men get 15 haircuts to choose from. Women get 15 haircuts to choose from. Whatever flavor of the undercut is picked, men in North Korea will be thankful that their leader picked haircuts out of a mid-80s GQ magazine. But don't let hair fool you. North Koreans enjoy their lives on many levels. One of the most rewarding things to do in the country's capital of Pyongyang is visit the zoo. On display is a wide variety of animals, including lions, elephants, monkeys, and a vibrant aquarium. Visitors from the United States will be pleasantly amused to even find a dog exhibition featuring German Shepherds, St. Bernards, and Shih Tzus, common household pets in the States but exotic animals in North Korea thanks to a strict pet policy. The zoo's most famous attraction and a local favorite is a must-see for returning visitors and tourists alike. Azalea, the smoking chimpanzee, is a wonderful reminder of North Korea's dedication to laughing at life's quirks. Smoking chimpanzees, state-approved haircuts, and a long history of violence spell out the more disturbing things that North Koreans have been subject to under the Kim Dynasty. The dazzling trio of North Korea's 3 brightest rays of light, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un, have always kept it interesting to say the least. Here are the craziest, most unhinged moments from each of the supreme leaders. Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung had a reputation for being a ruthless leader who was willing to do whatever it took to protect his country's interests. During his rule, he ordered hundreds of executions, and some of his craziest moments involved these executions. One of his most notorious executions was that of General Pak Hong-yong. General Pak was a former North Korean defense minister and a rival of Kim Il-sung. In December 1955, General Pak was arrested, tried, and convicted of plotting a coup against Kim Il-sung. He was executed with a single shot to the head, and his body was publicly displayed for 3 days in a Pyongyang square as a warning to any would-be traitors. However, when he was not ruthlessly executing political rivals, Kim Il-sung indulged in the usual mindless displays of power. He developed a cult of personality that has been a long-standing tradition in North Korea, with his image being seen everywhere in the country from statues and monuments to posters and books. He is seen as a leader and a father figure to many North Koreans, and his teachings and philosophies are still taught in North Korean schools today. His ideology of Juche, or self-reliance, has also become part of North Korean culture, and his legacy is still celebrated and revered by many North Koreans. Kim Jong-il. After his father's death in 1994, Kim Jong-il came to power in North Korea and ushered in a new era of bizarre antics. One of Kim's most outrageous moments was when he attempted to solve North Korea's hunger problem by importing giant rabbits from Germany. He believed that the meat yielded by these rabbits would end his people's starvation. However, Carl Schmalinsky, the world expert breeder of giant rabbits, explained to Kim that these rabbits only yielded about 15 pounds of meat and had huge appetites requiring lots of vegetables to stay alive, which made them unsuitable for combating famine. Despite this, Kim decided to purchase 12 rabbits for about $115 each. Ultimately, Smolinski believes that Kim ate the rabbits to celebrate his birthday. Another of Kim's outrageous moments was when he decided to rid the capital city of short people. He had pamphlets distributed in Pyongyang describing a wonder drug that would help short people grow taller. As people began lining up in response to the pamphlet, they quickly got the feeling that something was off. Unsurprisingly, there was no wonder drug. It was Kim's way of gathering the shortest members of society in one place so he could round them up and have them sent away. Kim also had some strange habits. He had a staff of women inspect his rice before it entered his palace's kitchen, making sure each piece met his standard for uniformity and plumpness. Additionally, he made sure that he never took addictive substances alone. He had a staff of people take the same drugs as him. For example, if he was prescribed a painkiller, he would make his staff take the painkiller medication with him. Kim Jong-un. As the torch once again passed from father to son, so Kim Jong-il died and Kim Jong-un assumed his position as supreme leader of North Korea. Kim Jong-un's regime has had its fill of ridiculous and terrifying displays of force, but one disheartening example was when he ordered the confiscation of all pet dogs in Pyongyang in 2020. Blaming Western decadence, Kim ordered the removal of all pet dogs and even used force to separate some dogs from their owners. The mass confiscation of pet dogs was especially concerning given North Korea's ongoing food shortage, which led many to believe that their pets were heading towards becoming someone's next meal. Another bizarre moment was when Kim Jong-un allegedly had a former army vice minister killed with a mortar round in 2012 for drinking and partying after his father's death. Moreover, in recent history, Kim has carried out many purges within his cabinet that aim to eliminate anyone deemed a threat. These executions of senior officials are often public and horrifying in their violence. In one instance, Hwang Min, a former agricultural minister, and Hyun Yong-chol, a defense minister, were paraded out in front of an anti-aircraft gun and shot with an anti-aircraft round. Kim's odd behavior has been further demonstrated through his friendships with controversial figures, such as basketball star Dennis Rodman. Rodman's been on several highly publicized trips to North Korea, including one time when he took 10 retired basketball players to play a game in North Korea for the Supreme Leader's birthday. During these visits, Rodman has publicly described Kim as a big kid who just wants to have fun. Kim also has an odd taste in music, having created his own pop band named Maranbong Band. The group debuted in 2012 and made waves in the music scene with catchy tunes like Do Prosper, Era of the Workers' Party. To no one's surprise, these gals were less of a hit among the rest of the world. Perhaps there is some hope for the future, though, as Kim Jong-un has shown interest in working with both South Korea and the United States. In 2018, tensions between North and South Korea decreased as President Trump became the first U.S. president to enter North Korean territory, and Kim crossed over to South Korea during a series of summits. In the Winter Olympics, North and South Korea marched together in the opening ceremonies, and players from both countries played on a unified Korean ice hockey team. Although the threat of nuclear war still looms in the background and North Korea has much work to do in fixing its human rights violations, perhaps cooperation with countries such as the United States will allow North Korea to enter an era of universal prosperity, or at least one where everyone gets to choose their own haircut.
The truth of Holodomor. The starvation started in the spring of '33, sometime near the end of February. A terrible starvation started because they were putting this squeeze on us. Even if someone went to get something, they'd then take it all right away. Even if someone scrounged up a handful of millet, tossed it in water and boiled it in a pot, they'd smash that pot and throw it into the yard. This is one testimony of many Ukrainians who suffered through Holodomor, the man-made famine of 1932 to 1933 that saw millions of people die due to instructions laid out by Joseph Stalin, the head of the USSR. Initially, historians argued about whether or not the famine was deliberate or an unfortunate consequence of Stalin policy. This is largely due to the fact that for years after, documentary sources were unable to include information directly from Ukraine. The information that did manage to make it to the rest of the world was on the lips of eyewitnesses or foreigners, such as journalists and diplomats who had seen the truth of Holodomor for themselves. In fact, the leading authority on Ukraine, Stanislav Kulczycki, changed his views rapidly following the decades after Holodomor, as more information came to light. Now certain it was a deliberate attack on the Ukrainian population by Joseph Stalin in an attempt to bring them to heel. While famines had already existed in Ukraine in the early 1930s, Kulczycki came to recognize the difference between these and Holodomor, referring to it as genocide, as 1932 to 1933 had a good harvest. Stalin had long since felt that the USSR relied too heavily on peasant farmers for grain acquisition and to feed the nation, and sought to end this reliance through a system called collectivism, a concept he launched in 1928 after publishing an article regarding the subject in the Pravda newspaper. Collectivism wasn't a new concept for the USSR, but Stalin definitively put it into force during his regime. Collectivism can be simply described as the removal of individual ownership of farms and property, instead assimilating it into a larger collective, stripping Ukrainian farmers of their autonomy.
To further alienate and differentiate the farmers, Stalin started to once again use the word kulak in referring to them, a term that had vanished from public use some years earlier. His plan, as revealed in a speech on December 27, 1929, was threefold. Stalin intended to divide the kulaks into three categories and work to eliminate the class as a whole. The first, recognized as actively hostile, i.e. they withheld grain, were to be handed over to political police and sent to concentration camps while their families were deported. The second, the most prosperous kulak households, were to be deported, and the third group were allowed to remain but were instead given the worst land to farm. The farmers soon found their property and crops confiscated, quickly failing to meet the harsh quotas imposed by Stalin. These were just the first steps of collectivization, policies that meant grain, livestock, and property were seized, and those deported, often to places like Siberia, were packed by the thousands onto trains with no food or water. Animals and people died as Stalin established impossible to obtain quotas, leading fanatic followers in the forms of local police of the regime to seize the remaining food and water from accused kulaks, leaving them to starve. As the peasants attempted to flee Ukraine, Stalin stonewalled them, creating a blockade that prevented them from leaving famine behind, and blacklisted entire regions to prevent them from receiving any aid from in or outside of the USSR. His campaign of misinformation meant that very few outside of the Soviet Union, or indeed Ukraine itself, had little idea how truly devastating things had become. It is important, however, as both Dushnik and Graziosi acknowledge, to separate the 1933 Holodomor from earlier spontaneous famines that occurred in the Ukraine in 1930 and 31, and indeed across the whole of the USSR, the key difference being the change in human response. The earlier famine of 1932 to 33, referred to as the All-Union Famine by Kulczycki, was still caused by Soviet policy and the seizure of grain. However, it was across all USSR nations and a result of Stalin's grain appropriation, leaving peasants with nothing of their own and driving them into cities where they then died. The historian calls this a case of insufficiency, whereas Holodomor is more strictly defined as a case of absolute starvation due to USSR actions such as requisitioning all provisions and barricading peasants in their towns and villages. And so, we return to January 1933, mere days after Stalin announces his collectivism measures and plans to eliminate the kulak class. Every household was to be searched and any food provision seized, something described in multiple accounts from those who experienced it. Brigades were organized in every village that had a village council, and these brigades went around to the collective and individual farmers and took everything until nothing was left. If they found a handful of millet, they took it. If they found a handful of pumpkins, they took them. This once again highlights the key difference between Holodomor and earlier famines, where once grain was taken, now everything was under the same pretense, leaving the Ukrainians with quite literally nothing. In desperate attempts to get the sustenance any way they could, villagers often were forced to eat soup or porridge made from frozen herbs and rotting potatoes, snails, goose feet, or even just the leftover shells of sunflower seeds. With no other option, where they were not blockaded, people tried to flee to the cities in the hopes that more food would be available. But it was not just physically Ukraine that was blockaded. In these years, very little information made its way in or out of the country, with the rest of the world oblivious to the millions of people impacted and starving due to Stalin's policies. Any rumors of starvation were quickly quashed as vicious anti-Soviet propaganda and denied. The world would have been totally oblivious had it not been for the actions of the Welsh journalist Gareth Jones. In 1933, he snuck into Ukraine and returned to break the truth of what was happening there to the world. He wrote, "Everywhere was the cry, 'There is no bread, we are dying.' In the train, a communist denied to me that there was a famine. 'We are waiting for death,' was my welcome. But see, we still have our cattle fodder. Go farther south, there they have nothing. Many houses are empty of people already dead," they cried. 2 years later, Jones was dead, murdered on an assignment in China and Japan. It's long since been suspected that this was no coincidence, as in the words of David Lloyd George, Mr. Gareth Jones knew too much. But in Ukraine, little changed, as the world argued the truth of his words. In the cities, people lined up for food in lines that had no sustenance at their ends, dying where they stood in the street. Polish council in Kiev and Kharkiv reported policemen picking up the dead and dying, sending the worst to die from lethal injection, and children who experienced daily raids from the adults in charge, leaving the young to starve. One of the worst and darkest side effects of Holodomor was the measures those still alive were forced to go through to survive, the worst of all perhaps being cannibalism. Allegedly something that was more common in rural areas, cannibalism became somewhat widespread during the Stalin-made famine, with enough eyewitness reports to corroborate the legitimacy of claims of its occurrence. This is further backed up by a 1933 August intelligence report stating prisons were full of cannibals across the cities of Ukraine. The truth is, we'll probably never know the real number of deaths due to Holodomor, thanks to the strict propaganda machine of the USSR and the banning of even the word famine. Estimates have increased as more sources have come to light, but historians place these guesses anywhere between 5 and 11 million people, a number that brings Holodomor in line with the later Nazi Holocaust.
Perestroika and Glasnost. The Cold War. In the 1980s, the USSR faced a wave of internal problems. The economy was suffering, the political elite was dying out, and corruption was eating away at society. While the people were going hungry, many state officials were traveling with private planes and limousines. Alcoholism was also prevalent, as vodka was one of the cheapest commodities. In the first part of the 1980s, 3 successive Russian leaders died of natural causes. This brought even more instability to a state in crisis. Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on the scene in 1985. Known for his birthmark on his forehead, he gained the nickname the Marked One. Although he was 54, he was one of the youngest members of the Communist Party. His policies were centered around the idea of reforming and modernizing the Soviet Union. He believed the conservative communist approach to be outdated. The USSR was facing new problems, and he proposed new solutions. In over 6.5 years as the Soviet leader, Gorbachev attempted to radically restructure the USSR, which was lagging behind its competition, the United States. 2 policies that marked the era that followed were perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika, or in English, restructuring, was an attempt of Gorbachev to revitalize and westernize the stagnant economy of the Soviet Union. The centralized production of the state was no match for the free-flowing market of the United States. The USSR was struggling to dig themselves out of their economic hole and needed to make changes fast. In the Soviet economy, supply did not meet demand. There was a great deal of money being invested into military projects, such as the war in Afghanistan, but consumer goods were neglected. Agriculture was declining, which led to statewide food shortages. Times were tough, and the Soviet Union even had to resort to importing large amounts of wheat from their fiercest rivals, the United States. Until the second part of the 1980s, all components of production were under the monopoly of the state. Factories were told what to produce, how much they should produce, and what the price of their products should be. There was no competition in the market, and there was no incentive for businesses to do better. Gorbachev proposed a new market model, which would give businesses more freedom. His hope was that a freer market would restore balance slowly and organically. Many of the older members of the Communist Party frowned upon Gorbachev's ambitious plans. They believed that the reforms would mean admitting defeat against the United States in the Cold War and would undermine the basis of the political system that made them great in the first place. The new economic policies implemented by Gorbachev meant that businesses would have more autonomy. Their budget was still decided by the Communist Party, except now they could decide on how to use the money. Workers could elect their own managers. The hope was that this would be an incentive for managers to generate more profit. However, this was often not the case. Nevertheless, the perestroika reforms introduced a level of entrepreneurship and competition in the Soviet market. Small businesses were allowed to open, such as shops or car mechanics, which were independent from the state and relied solely on their own profit. The economy of the USSR, which was previously characterized by centralization and rigorous control, had now made steps towards a capitalist economy. Glasnost, or in English, openness, was the second main reform implemented by Gorbachev. It targeted 3 main affairs: corruption, media, and culture. Corruption was common in the Communist Party.
One of the most notable instances of corruption involved Yuri Trebanov, a former Russian leader's son-in-law who got friendly with the Central Asian cotton mafia. Before being caught and sentenced to 12 years hard labor, thanks to his high rank of general, he protected the mafia and helped rob the USSR of the equivalent of $6.5 billion. With the Glasnost reforms, Gorbachev aimed to increase transparency within the government in order to prevent further financial misconducts. Policies were also introduced to reduce censorship. Censorship was an integral part of state control in the USSR. Newspapers could not print a word without the interference of the state. The media was a tool of Soviet propaganda, and Big Brother was watching over every word. Gorbachev softened censorship and therefore increased the freedom of the press. This was a giant step towards a free media and the free flow of information. People could now speak out against the regime without fear of being sent to gulags. Writers and thinkers who were previously exiled could now live and publish in their homeland. Thanks to the Glasnost policies, which allowed for the freedom of expression, Russian culture began to bloom. Solzhenitsyn was a famous Russian writer who spent 8 years in a Stalinist labor camp for criticizing the dictator in a private letter. Later, he lived in exile in Germany, as he was an outspoken critic of the Soviet Union. Because of Glasnost, extracts of his book The Gulag Archipelago could appear in the Soviet literary magazine Novy Mir in 1989. With his citizenship restored in 1990, he returned to Russia in 1994. Perestroika and Glasnost were radical steps made by Gorbachev to lead the USSR out of a crisis. His ideas improved the USSR's relationship with the West, and most importantly, with the United States. The changes he made marked the beginning of an end, the end of the Soviet Union. The restructuring implemented by him did not lead to the success he envisioned. He was applauded in the West for the democratization of the Soviet Union, for which he was given a Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. However, he slowly lost popularity within the state, which led to his resignation in 1991. By the end of that same year, the Soviet Union had completely broken up into independent nations. He was blamed for the falling apart of the great USSR. Upon seeing the freedoms granted by Perestroika and Glasnost, the satellite states were also craving change. The crisis in the USSR was just as present in the Eastern Bloc, and the people of Eastern Europe were hoping the policies would be introduced in their homelands as well. Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine, which legitimized Soviet Russia's use of force in the satellite states if they defied communism. The Red Army would no longer suppress uprisings as they did in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. This brought great changes in the Eastern Bloc. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and the communist rulers all over Eastern Europe began to fall. Although he couldn't lead the Union out of its economic crisis, Gorbachev's reforms marked the beginning of an entirely new Russian Republic. The changes culminated into a strange sight in Moscow as the babushkas and the dedushkas were lining up in front of the first ever McDonald's in the Soviet Union for their first ever taste of the Big Mac.